Our next panel, and I'm going to be part of this panel, is The Great Society, Then and Now, Reimagining the Racial Justice and Public Policy Legacies of the 1960s. And we have a really great group of panelists. I will start with Jeremy Suri, who's to my immediate right, who's the Mack Brown Distinguished Professor for Global Leadership, History, and Public Policy here at UT. And Jeremy is the author of many books, including a great political biography of Henry Kissinger, but also his first book, Power and Protest, was a very innovative, groundbreaking look at social protest movements globally in the 1960s and how they reverberated and really transformed different competing notions of democracy, citizenship, activism in that era. We've got Leah Wright-Rigueur, who's Assistant Professor of Public Policy at the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy, Harvard Kennedy School of Government. And Leah is the author of a really groundbreaking book called The Loneliness of the Black Republican, out from Princeton University Press last year, which I'm teaching in my civil rights movement class. And it's a real groundbreaking history of Black Republicans that starts during the New Deal all the way to the present and really transforms our understanding of the relationship between African Americans and the Republican Party during the 20th century, especially in that crucial period post-1968 when we see political realignment. You know, the black republicanism has a very deep and honorable history, and that becomes transformed, it becomes fraught, it becomes contested in the context of the civil rights movement of the 1960s and political realignment that occurs that really transforms both the Democratic and Republican parties. So she's really written a major work on that. And then we have Bob Wilson, who's professor of the LBJ School of Public Affairs right here at UT, our outgoing dean of the school, and the editor of a brand new book on LBJ's neglected legacy, which really is a groundbreaking book that has brought a lot of different scholars together to look at really how LBJ's Great Society continues to reverberate in our own time, whether you're thinking about public schools or housing or healthcare or voting, and gives a really panoramic view of that. And what we'll be talking about today is really this idea of the Great Society. In a way, LBJ is undergoing a renaissance in a lot of different ways. And that renaissance is connected both to popular culture, when we think about everything from Selma to the HBO film All the Way, which was a Broadway play, All the Way, which is now being turned into HBO film. And also, there's a major motion picture on LBJ where Woody Harrelson is starring as LBJ. So there really is this kind of renaissance. But the Great Society, you know, what do we mean by the Great Society? How do we look at it now and then? We live in a contemporary period where we refuse to talk about a war on poverty. We have a war on drugs. You know, the war on poverty became the war on drugs. So Then and Now, Reimagining Racial Justice and Public Policy Legacies of the 1960s. So we'll start. What order?
How do you want to do it?
Not me first.
Leah doesn't want to go first.
She doesn't want to go first. I'll go first.
Go first.
I'm ready to go.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Okay, I'm Bob Wilson from the LBJ School, and I also want to welcome our panelists and our visitors here to Austin to commemorate the launching of Peniel's Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. I think a center that's going to have a terrific impact on the LBJ School, the University of Texas, and also on Texas. I've been working with Peniel for the last 5 or 6 months, getting him here, and it's really been a great pleasure, and we're all excited about you being here. And this seminar, this workshop, is really a great way to launch it. I thought the panelists we've heard so far have been spectacular. I thought it was very smart to schedule this just before a blizzard. It's easier to get speakers here during blizzards. A very interesting set of presentations. I'm going to talk about the Great Society, and in the presentations that I've made so far, many of the points that I want to make have been made. I'm going to maybe present it in a slightly different context. As Peniel mentioned, we've just finished a book looking at the Great Society and domestic policy legacies, and we commissioned paper on 12 different policy arenas and understood what LBJ did, the Great Society programs, how these policies have fared over the last 50 years now, and what do we see today, what are the remnants of that. So that's the framework that I'm going to be working on. I'm going to pull out what I'm going to be calling racial justice and social justice and race issues. I don't think LBJ ever wrote a document that looked at social justice and race per se, but looking across his range of policies, there's a lot of the Great Society policies were much concerned about the issue of race in America, and so I'll try to pull that out. And following Stefan a little bit, he laid out pretty well the framework I'm going to be using. It's kind of the engineer's approach. We're going to talk about how he defined the problem, the policy window, why were things able to be accomplished in the 1960s. Probably not too much on that. What strategies were adopted, how they've been sustained or not over time, and then some lessons for the contemporary period. One thing that is characteristic of LBJ is that he framed policy issues in a very broad manner. If you think about poverty policy, a whole range of dimensions, some poverty alleviation, there's also health, there's also housing, there's also education. So I think the same framework needs to be understood in terms of the Great Society and LBJ in terms of social justice and race. It really covers a range of topics, issues that he saw and the society saw at that point in time that were very pressing. There's one set of policies around rights, human rights, civil rights, voting rights. So that would be one key component, and it was a response in part to the extent of discrimination that we had in the society at that point in time. We've heard a lot about that today. Divided society was, at least in the South, James Crow, it was the law, and Jim Crow. And so part of the strategy was to handle that. But the issue of social justice and race also enters into some other policy arenas. In the area of poverty, poverty was not explicitly an area that I feel he pursued because of the racial dimension to it, but race was important in that. We have other areas, human capital development, education. They were not explicitly focused on race, but had very important implications. So we need to look at that part of it. LBJ was very much concerned about how modern advanced society, a wealthy society, had poverty, poor health outcomes, and so forth. So that was an important dimension of it. And there was another dimension that I will characterize, and these are not his terms, but the failure of government to act properly, to be effective, to be efficient. The failure of our public policy institutions in a variety of ways. And I think he saw this in part in terms of the kinds of services, the kinds of integration of African Americans into American society. So this was another part of the policy problem, social justice and race, the performance of government. And I'll elaborate on that in just a little bit. In terms of the policy window, just a couple of points on that. It was a very unique set of circumstances in the 1960s. We had a very strong civil rights movement that had been in place for decades, had been gaining strength. We had highly visible incidents of violence that were part of the national policy debate. We've heard about those today. We also had a president, JFK, that was going to be able to build on the legacy of some things that Kennedy started, but also arriving at very unique circumstances, the death of LBJ, later the death of MLK. So we're in a period of crisis, a huge majority in Congress. Circumstances that really were unique to the 1960s. And we have a master statistician in Congress. New Congress knew how to get things passed. Some of those elements are not in place today, so we can't expect a repeat of the Great Society anytime soon. In terms of policy strategies, a number of policies essentially brought to the end Jim Crow laws, the right to discriminate in various circumstances. And it's important to remember just the whole range of areas where this was important. Discrimination in labor markets, in housing markets, in higher education, in a whole range of areas. Those Jim Crow laws came down, And there is no longer a legal basis today, a formal legal basis for discrimination. It is, in fact, prohibited. In the human capital area, LBJ advanced in some areas that sometimes we forget. Public education, when in particular the federal government had a very minor role in education up until that point. Through a series of laws, this became an important strategy. Various elements of it, part of it is opening up higher education, desegregation of higher education universities was an important element, but also the K through 12 effort, compensatory policies, funding, and also Head Start, all important initiatives. So this was another dimension of how LBJ would think about issues of social justice. Other areas, health, a lot of new activity in the area of health, environmental quality, another topic not clearly focused on social justice and on race, but we know that poor environmental conditions were having a differential impact on minority communities. So this was another strategy that he adopted. So a broad range of policies, different kinds of instruments. Sometimes these were legal enforcements depending on the Department of Justice. Other instances, the resources of the federal government were being brought to bear, expansion in public education. In terms of improving public sector institutions, there's a variety of mechanisms. One, to use the federal government to desegregate the federal government itself, to make sure that hospitals would no longer discriminate on employment. The LBJ would withhold funds from those institutions. So the composition of the public sector changed during that point in time. And then also the Voting Rights Act, which is fundamental. The number of elected officials at the time of the Voting Rights Act, a few hundred, and a change enormously soon thereafter. I want to say a few words about sustainability of his efforts. And here the record is really quite mixed. In some areas, we very much see the trajectory today in today's world. In other areas, it's evolved. Sometimes things have disappeared. LBJ was very much concerned about cities, urban policy. The federal presence now dealing with cities is really pretty minor. So it's important to recognize there's a range of these policy areas. The evolution has been different. In terms of the enforcement of anti-discrimination policies, here the record also is mixed. In some arenas, one that was in the chapter written for our book that was very surprising, that discrimination in public accommodations was broadly accepted pretty quickly after the Civil Rights Act, much to everybody's surprise. In other areas, we think about employment, the EEOC still having a struggle to move forward in pursuing discrimination in labor markets, but probably the one that I feel that is most important, perhaps because of my interest in cities, has to do with residential segregation and also resegregation of schools, as has been mentioned earlier today. The mechanisms for the fair housing policy adopted during the Johnson's period were weak. At that point in time, everybody knew they were going to be weak. There was no powers of enforcement. Many people say it was really pretty miraculous that any fair housing law was passed in '68. But this is one area that we've not advanced. Now, we've just had an interesting Supreme Court decision that may change that perspective here moving on. The other thing I would like to talk about is the sustainability in instances where the policies have not been sustained, a little bit on why that's the case. And probably, I think we can identify kind of a conservative counter-movement to the Great Society that is with us. It's grown, it's strong, and this is one of the reasons why a lot of the policies of the Great Society have been kind of undermined or discarded. We see it initially with Nixon trying to turn the tables back on some things, but particularly Reagan and later. The courts sometimes are used to undermine important law. The Voting Rights Act was changed recently. In other areas, the courts are more favorable, so this is an actor in the process. The executives themselves, we find sometimes presidents that will use the Department of Justice to enforce discrimination laws. I think Obama would be strong in that area. Other presidents have not. Another feature since the Great Society, a lot of this legislation implementation has fallen back to states and local governments. And again, state executives, governors that are engaged in this issue, mayors that are engaged in these kinds of issues move forward. We see a lot of resistance in other areas. In terms of lessons, Johnson was committed to getting laws on the books, the expression that's used, laws on the books, get legislation passed, even if it was imperfect, waiting for later Congresses to improve upon the laws. And in some regards, it was highly successful. In other regards, getting laws on the books were not sufficient. We see today in our body politic areas where issues have not been resolved, in part because of flawed legislation from the Great Society period, but also this strong conservative movement that has really impeded progress in many areas. Residential segregation, I think, would be right up there at the top. But more broadly, I think we see in a lot of the disparate outcomes, social outcomes we've talked about, income outcomes, education, and so forth, many of the gaps that we see back in the 1960s are still with us. Some instances not as big as they were before, but many other areas they were are still with us, suggesting that kind of laws on the books themselves are not sufficient. There are other elements that are important. And one very promising thing, I think, with current social movements is that element has not been as prominent for the last several decades, so that may change the context here in a little bit. Another point that I'll just reemphasize was made on this last panel. One of the other big changes now is that our racial divide, in my terms, my sense, is not just white-black as it was so prominently in the 1960s, but now we have, in fact, have a multicultural society, and figuring out how to build coalitions across cultures, I think, is going to be a really important issue. So I'll stop with that.
Okay, so I'll go next. Thank you again, Peniel, for organizing this conference. For many years, I had the privilege of coming to your conference at Tufts and finally realized it made a lot more sense to have it here in Austin. And I think the blizzard confirms that.
Absolutely.
In fact, Peniel's a longtime friend and fellow troublemaker.
Yes.
It's nice to finally have you here. I also want to thank Lovedie, our colleague, who's our conference organizer extraordinaire. This is really a great moment for our campus and for your center, Peniel. So I'm a historian, and I want to talk about the history of the Great Society and how we should think about that history today. And I think there are a lot of problematic ways in which we talk about the Great Society as citizens, as activists, as policy experts, and as historians. There tends to be a divide in the way, across all these dimensions, we think about the Great Society. There are those who want to return to the Great Society, and there are many of those in this building, in fact, who want to return to the Great Society, and that's okay. They point to the legislation. They point to many of the achievements that Bob Wilson has done such a marvelous job of documenting. Then there are many others, and Bob called these the conservative counter-revolution or conservative alternative, that see the Great Society as the negative alternative, that from which we should run. And you can see examples of both in our lives every day. One of the Great Society accomplishments is that our airplanes don't fall out of the sky anymore, right? The Federal Transportation Safety Board. Is there anyone who really wants to get rid of the Federal Transportation Safety Board? Probably no one, especially when you fly home from here, right? On the other end, we can all think of massive urban projects like the one I grew up in, actually, where people were put into these massive facilities with federal aid and encouragement, which actually were not successful. The income-subsidized community I grew up in New York City had all kinds of pathologies that were encouraged by a top-down approach to understanding how poverty and inequality and immigration, I'm from an immigrant family, how immigrants should be assimilated into society, and a very gendered approach also, which was very male-centered in the ways in which authority was attributed. So there are problems on both sides. I think the best way to think about the Great Society is not to think about it in these extreme terms or to think about it in these categorical terms, but to look at Great Society questions and Great Society programs. And the secret of successful policy making, and I think there were many Great Society successes in its own time, is that the questions rarely produce policy solutions. They produce policy dynamics and narratives that over time need to evolve. So my argument for the Great Society is that we have to return to some of the questions that not just Lyndon Johnson, but many Great Society activists asked, which I think actually the Black Lives Matter movement is now beginning to ask with quite a lot of sophistication, in fact, that we need to return to those questions, but that does not mean we should return to the LBJ policies. We should study them as a foundation for new policy innovations today. My frustration is that we tend to choose sides, and we either want to remake the 60s or we want to forget the 60s. My argument is that we need to historicize the 60s and build upon those questions with innovative policy choices that evolve from the decisions that were made at their time for their own reasons. That's how policy is actually made. As Claude Lévi-Strauss put it, right? All of social science really is not about progress, it's about bricolage. It's about building one thing on another, right? And making the tower adjust to the winds in which it is buffeted at any particular moment. So let me talk a little bit about how I think about that. I'm sure all of you have many other more interesting and sophisticated ways of thinking about it. If Peniel disagrees with me, just please ignore everything he says. So the first area where I think we can look at the Great Society as a set of questions and a set of policies from which we can then evolve our own thinking today is in the area of race and economics. One of the great accomplishments of the Great Society, and it does not begin in the White House, it actually begins among African-American sociologists and others working in places like the University of Chicago and elsewhere, is to begin to ask questions about the intersection between race and economics in terms of a modern post-industrial economy. One of the key observations that's made in the early 1960s is that the African-American labor that has moved along with other immigrant labor to find certain jobs has not only been segregated, but has been systematically denied certain forms of opportunity. And that opportunity does not correlate with short-term wages. That people could see wage increases as many immigrant households, as many African-American households, as many Hispanic and Asian-American households saw. You can see income growth, but not see opportunity growth, that they're two separate things. There is not necessarily a direct correlation between the two. And one of the great advancements in the Great Society was not simply to ask about income or GNP, all of which looked like good measures in the early 60s, and that's what the Kennedy people are saying, but to look at opportunity, long-term chances for life improvements, and the ways in which structural elements of the American economy diminish the opportunities for those who might even see real consumption gains in the short run. And this is a great accomplishment of the Great Society because it moves us beyond what I would say is often the numerology of economic measurement, which departs quite a bit from the reality of economic existence. And that's particularly true for those who don't control the way the numerology is actually put together. The Great Society develops a whole new set, and Bob Wilson knows this better than I do, all new sets of ways of measuring and thinking about these issues, and it builds on one of the great insights from the New Deal, which is that the qualitative collection of information of stories is actually one of the most important ways of understanding and narrating the experiences of various groups. One of the great accomplishments of the New Deal is to use the surplus labor at the time to collect the stories of many communities. We still use those as historians, actually. And the 1960s is another moment when this happens. In fact, I would argue one of the reasons you see so much media interest in this is that you already have intellectual interest in these stories that provide the foundation. One of the reasons that many white young men and women from the North are traveling south is because they want to see these stories. They want to be part of that. They're collecting those stories. The most important question in terms of race and economics that the Great Society asks that wasn't asked before is how can government open opportunities that are not simply measured by the pocketbooks of families, but by the broader definition of life chances for them. The broader definition of life chances for them. Many of the Great Society policies work in their time but do not work in the long term. I grew up in New York City as an immigrant, and many of the outgrowths of Great Society policies in New York City from the 1960s were the problems of the 1970s in the cities. Crime, overcrowding, poor allocation of resources, excessive use of federal welfare money for problems that were not solvable in that way. So it's not that the programs solve for the long term, though they certainly made many issues better. They opened a set of questions. And the responses to some failed elements of those programs, unfortunately, closed off the asking of that question. Just think how rarely today we ask really about opportunity and life chance. When we think about our discussion of economics, even our own president has fallen into the wrong way of talking about this. He wants to measure a graduate from a university by their income 5 years out, not by their life chances 5 years out. And I would argue those are two different things. Those are two different things. So economics and race is one area. The second area is the area I've studied very closely and am very passionate about, is foreign policy. Foreign policy. And this is always the hardest issue to talk about when talking about Lyndon Johnson, because the word Vietnam inevitably comes up, despite the efforts by some not to talk about the Vietnam War. You can't talk about Lyndon Johnson without talking about the Vietnam War. Lyndon Johnson had a vision of the world, which, as he said as vice president, was very simple. He said, everyone from Vietnam to South Texas wants to live a better life and have more say in their government, and that we should have a foreign policy that's about that. When he went to Vietnam as vice president, he actually handed out LBJ pens to illiterate peasants, thinking that this was a way of symbolically telling them they could be more engaged in the policy process. Of course, they did not know what to do with these LBJ pens. Actually, there's a museum in Vietnam that has LBJ pens in it as a sort of memento to that moment. Johnson's vision was an expansive New Deal vision of a world opening to more democratic participation, and it presumed that a more democratic world would be a more peaceful world. But the problem with that vision was that it was married to an ever-growing military-industrial complex. And part of what the Vietnam War was an expression of anti-communism and an expression of a set of military assumptions that didn't work. And we could talk about why, but everyone understands why, did not match up with the reality on the ground. We can argue over the degree to which there was a threat or a reason for the United States to be involved, but that seems almost beside the point. The massive American capabilities, the massive American activities in Vietnam clearly did not address the concern or the problem, nor did they democratize the society, right? Some have said to me, look at Vietnam today, and it's actually a vibrant capitalist society. It's not a democratic society. All of that would be despite what we did, not because of what we did. Lyndon Johnson cannot take credit for that. His foreign policy was deeply flawed, and in fact, that has given ammunition to Republicans and has given ammunition to their condemnation of democratic foreign policy, including Barack Obama's, ever since. The problem with their condemnation is that they haven't offered a viable alternative. What is it that our foreign policy should be about? One of the great legacies of the Great Society is to ask how our foreign policy can line up with our values. How it can line up with our values, and to ask what role our government can play in actually making the lives of other people better. We should not necessarily get involved in the world everywhere to solve every problem. We can't. Sometimes we make them worse. But to simply say we can only solve a problem if it serves our interests or our security in the short run is clearly a short-sighted approach. And we've fallen into that, actually. We've fallen very much into that. The Great Society question should be about bringing values more into our foreign policy in a strategic way. It is not sufficient, as our president says, to simply try to hit singles and doubles. If we are a great society, we should be about more, but that does not mean intervention everywhere, obviously. Last area. The Great Society was in many ways about imagining a new relationship between the federal government and state and local governments. And by the way, Bob Wilson's book is terrific on this, I think, showing how Lyndon Johnson believed in FDR fashion that the federal government had to do so much more to, quote unquote, turn the lights on for people. But he also, coming out of state government in Texas, coming out of his experience at the National Youth Administration, saw a major role for state government. Lyndon Johnson's question was how government could bring the best people together to do the best for citizens around them. What's happened as a consequence of the Great Society, however, in part because of his policies and in part because of the bastardization of his policies, is that state government has become not only a point of resistance, which it was before, but if I might say so, a point of incompetence. Many state governments are led by people who would not be those we would choose to be the best representatives of our society, and that's not a political statement. It can be said on one side or the other. Part of the problem is the compensation one gets for going into state government. Part of the problem is the lack of respect one gets for going into state government. So some of it is our fault for disrespecting those who go into these kinds of jobs. But I would tell you, if you put up the nature of the people in state government in the 60s versus today, you might have more people of racially questionable views in the 1960s, But you also had people of higher qualifications in terms of their ability to govern, in terms of their knowledge of policy, in terms of their familiarity and deep commitment to it. There are, of course, exceptions. But the Great Society was not simply about building a great federal government. It was about building a government of high talent and high performance all the way through. That question, that motivation, brought many people into government in the 60s. But then they stopped going. And we need to ask ourselves that question. I'm very disappointed even at the LBJ School that not enough of our graduates run for office. And I often ask them, why don't you run for office? And they have very good reasons why they don't run for office. You've got to raise a lot of money. You're going to have your name dragged through the mud. It's not a noble calling. In fact, it's a nobler calling in our society today to go work for a bank than it is to go run for state government. In fact, even at public policy schools. Look at how the best graduates go work for consulting companies rather than go into government, right? I'm not blaming the graduates, and I'm not blaming the consulting companies. Of course, they should hire talent, right? I'm asking us how we can get away from the false debate between whether the Great Society has brought the right people or the wrong people into government, and ask ourselves instead about how we can return to that core Great Society question, which is making our government a nobler place, a place where talented young women and young men strive to go at the beginnings of their careers to make a contribution. That was the Great Society ethos. There are a number of people in the audience, like my friend Harvey Berg and others, who were motivated, who were inspired by that vision. And what's missing in the Black Lives Matter movement now, what was certainly missing in the 99% or 1% movement, however we want to talk about it, was the desire to get into government, because much of it was a rejection of that. And if we really care about the Great Society, we care not so much about what the people did in government in the 60s and 70s. We care about reinstilling that imagination of a new role for government. So my final point is really that the Great Society is there for us not as a policy template. It's not there for us as a recipe, nor is it there for us as a whipping boy. It's not there for us as the alternative of all the bad things that could happen out of the false policies pursued out of good intentions. Instead, what the Great Society is for us is a set of questions about race and economics, questions about democracy and foreign policy, questions about the role of individuals and the integration of local, state, and federal government, questions that we need to ask and study, and questions that we should allow ourselves, and this is what I hope Peniel Center will do, allow us to take all of us to places we might not imagine going. I mean, the future Great Society is not going to look anything like Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. It's going to have very different policy innovations. It's going to be about more public-private partnerships, right? It's going to be about new ways of raising capital. It's going to be about new kinds of citizens. It's not going to be black and white, right? In this state, it's going to be largely Hispanic, as it should be, right? It's not going to be male-dominated, we hope. It's going to look very, very different. So the Great Society should be an opening for us. It should be a set of questions, and we should remember that policy builds on prior policies. It doesn't recreate it, but it doesn't simply react against it either. There's an alternative there, and that's the space we need to talk about. I'll leave it there.
Great. Thank you. That's good. Okay, Leah. She's getting up, man.
Sorry, I have to stand. I'm very much a stander. I'm normally a walker too, so I'm going to try not to walk out because otherwise I'll make a mess. I'm going to try and control my hands as well. So first, thank you all for coming out. I'm Leah Wright-Rigueur. I'm an assistant professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, but I am a historian by training and a multidisciplinary scholar by interest. So I should say that first, thank you all for having me here, and thank you to Dr. Joseph and the LBJ School for having me. I did a lot of my research for my first book on the loneliness of the Black Republican here at the Johnson School, at the Johnson Library, at the Johnson Archives, and if you get a chance, by all means, please go by and check out the museum, which is wonderful. But what do I work on? I work on Black Republicans, and so in some ways I have a bit of a challenge that the other panelists have not had. When people think of Black Republicans, they think of Stacey Dash, right, who has been in the news lately. They think of Clarence Thomas. They think of Ben Carson. This is the predominant way that we understand Black Republicans. Everything that we see around us reinforces this, whether it be on the news, whether it be somebody that we know, whether it be pop culture, whether it be scholarship. And I think part of this rests on a basic truth, which is that the extensive histories of civil rights and Black politics make very clear that African Americans have made critical and significant advances for racial equality and social justice by way of the New Deal and the Great Society programs, thereby anchoring African Americans in democratic liberalism. And it's to the point where, just think back to that clip, Tracee Ellis Ross's character, the mother, when she hears that her son may be a Republican, completely just breaks down, right? There's nothing worse in that moment. And yet we see them, we see Black Republicans, we see them everywhere. And part of what I want to do today, just in the couple minutes that I have very quickly, is to spend my time talking about, in fact, how African Americans have actually pushed back against the idea of democratic liberalism. One of the areas that I want to start off by talking with is by this idea that comes out of the Great Society. The 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, they provide some African Americans with the luxury or the opportunity or the freedom, however you want to frame it, to actually embrace conservatism and neoliberalism. It really changes the rules of the game. And this level of dissatisfaction that emerges actually unites Black power advocates, unusually, with Black Republicans in some ways, in a really kind of strange bedfellows kind of manner. Now, what I'd like to spend the rest of my time talking about is how one Black Republican in particular actually proposed an alternative to the Great Society programs. And that person is actually Ed Brooke. Now, Brooke is an interesting figure because he proposes a path that's not an embrace of the Great Society liberalism, but actually learned from it and proposed ideas as an alternative to it. And in fact, I argue that Brooke's brand of progressive republicanism is in fact the basis for modern neoliberalism. Now, Brooke rejects the Great Society programs as fundamentally inadequate. He accepts the humanitarian aspect of it, but he's particularly concerned with this idea of the anti-poverty aspect of it. Now, I don't agree in the slightest with the senator's assessment of the anti-poverty program, quote unquote, keeping people on welfare in perpetualness. I do think that there's a merit in looking at the senator's critique that the Great Society programs provided a dosage of aspirin to society's ills instead of eliminating the source of pain. Now, for Brooke, and what I take this to mean, is that the issue is about economic inequality. It is about power and how the two work together. So what I'd like to do is actually look at Brooke's approach as he talks about it in a white paper called The Open Society that he writes in 1966. Now, he argues that an open society was really a nation that extended to its citizens access to equal treatment under the law, quality education, decent housing, and health. And that sounds a lot like the Great Society programs. The difference here, though, is that Brooke really stressed this idea of the economic benefits of the free market. Now, I think there's a lot to be critical in terms of thinking about, as scholars, thinking about the benefits of the free market. But what I want to say and argue is that that idea of the free market is very much in tune with this idea of the American dream and how African Americans have used capitalism as a method of uplift and a method of power. A flawed way, a problematic way, a troubling way, but still a way nonetheless. And I'll come back to that in a second. Rather than relying on the federal government or the states, Brooke proposed a collaborative effort between the two branches of government that expanded the relationship to include heavy emphasis on private partnerships. So another example of this, for Brooke, housing segregation was linked to de facto segregation in schools, poor education was related to high unemployment and underemployment, and limitations on work-restricted income and economic mobility. Now, all of these issues, he argued, were exacerbated by the Johnson administration's uneven enforcement of civil rights laws. Now for Brooke, I think, and this is what's important, he argues that part of the open society means using the federal government to cut off funding from access to organizations and institutions engaged in legal and informal forms of segregation. And in fact, a lot of the programs that he suggests in the 1960s sound a lot like charter school programs or programs like Teach for America that we now know today. And so we see this in things like state governments, his suggestion that state governments and private institutions collaborate to build new schools and establish training opportunities for Black teachers. We also see that Brooke advocates for state school boards to incorporate minority history into education curriculum. Now, his signature program becomes an enforcement of federal and state fair housing laws and calling for public-private coordination of low and moderate income housing. And I say signature because, as I mentioned in a little bit of time, he actually becomes the co-sponsor of the Fair Housing Bill in 1968, and in 69, 70, and 71 introduces the Brooke Amendments. He also supports Philadelphia Plan-like ideas about the regulation of discrimination in unions, seeing class mobility as a way of lifting African Americans out of poverty and out of discrimination. And I think most radically, and probably in relationship, very much in relationship to the conversation that we've been having around reparations currently, Brooke proposes a federal indemnification board to provide monetary restitution to those individuals whose federally protected rights have been trampled by segregationists and racists. And in part, and I'll come back to this in my closing points, this reminds me so much of the path that so many Black lawyers recently have taken, pursuing civil rights as a means, or civil suits as a means of making the state pay for wrongs against Black life. In short, and the idea that I'm trying to get across today is that many African Americans have adopted the idea that capitalism or money has become a form of resistance or a protest method. And during the Q&A, I think we can really begin to kind of unpack this idea of capitalism and the merits of capitalism being seen as a protest method in an era of resistance and in an era where Black lives matter. Now, in 1966, Brooke is really articulating a vision wherein Blacks were individual citizens and Americans. So he's casting opposition to civil rights legislation as unconstitutional. And he's casting it as undemocratic, and I think that's important. We've heard that throughout the day about this idea of democracy. It's also important for our present-day battles for social justice as we think about the legacies of this time period, because this idea of racism and inequality as being undemocratic becomes an important way of framing contemporary battles for racial justice. It's also significant because it suggests, right, that there's a place for justice within the ideology of conservatism. Now that may seem paradoxical. Think back to that Blackish clip of what Black Republicans or what the Republican Party represents. But if we reframe conservatism in the way that Brooke talked about it in the 1960s, there's a space to say something like, police brutality is wrong because of state overreach, right? It's or the federal government overreach, that it's fundamentally undemocratic, and it's a new way of conceptualizing a lot of these ideas. Now, in my book, I talk a lot about the ways in which Brooke and other Black Republicans' approach to Black politics actually informs the modern GOP, but it also influences the development of a modern, quote-unquote, pragmatic Black politician. So the development of somebody like a Cory Booker, a Deval Patrick, a Barack Obama, who really emphasize self-help programs that rely heavily on voluntary partnerships with the private sector. This concept of power, pragmatic power, is fundamental to Brooke, and in fact unites him across ideological lines with several Black power advocates, including H. Rap Brown, who arranges a very covert meeting with Brooke in the mid-1960s. Now, the last point that I want to make before I just go on into kind of the legacies or the lessons from this kind of mix of Great Society liberalism with conservatism is to point out that for Brooke and for other Black Republicans in this particular moment, that the most important thing, the most important idea and the most important solution to continuing racial and economic inequality, roles for justice for African Americans, was for Black people, especially the Black poor, to organize into grassroots political movements to demand power in society, right? So the idea of mobilization, and mobilization not just from the Democratic Party, right, or within the context of democratic liberalism, but also within the Republican Party and within the context of conservatism, was crucial to this idea of amassing power and seeing significant change. Political scientists and historians like to actually talk about this in the contemporary period when they talk about African Americans being a captured constituency, where one party takes you for granted and the other party just doesn't care about you. The idea of using both political parties, right, for power, for mobilization, is the idea of being able to force change, right, being a swing vote. And to these ends, I think, Brooke really tried to use his positionality in the Republican Party to force significant change on social justice and racial issues. So the big issue that we really see emerge during this period is in the summer of 1967. Brooke calls for a resolution. He's the first senator of either party to call for a formal investigation into civil disorders, basically into riots in urban cities. 2 days later, President Johnson issues an executive order, right, creating the National Advisory for Commission on Civil Disorders, or in shorthand, the Kerner Commission. So I'm almost out of time. I'm really out of time. But one of the couple of things that I want to leave you with is that the Kerner Commission, Brooke is working on the Kerner Commission with Roy Wilkins, but in fact it informs their decision to propose, to co-sponsor along with Walter Mondale, the Fair Housing Commission. So legislation and working through a two-party bipartisan path actually becomes a way of proposing significant change. So I'll wrap up here with a few very, very quick points. And I'm going to speed through them, so please feel free to ask me about them. What are some of the legacies and lessons that we can learn from looking at an Ed Brooke and his critique of the racial justice aspects of the Great Society programs? The first is that conservatism could possibly offer a vision of the US where the ideology can be used for Black liberation. The second is that this vision isn't embraced by the Republican Party in the present day. I think we can all see that. But instead is actually embraced by modern Black Democrats, really as expressed by Barack Obama. So we really do see this idea of conservatism and liberalism of the Great Society coming together under the header of Barack Obama. The third is that it's a useful way of thinking about a critique, especially as some of these ideas that the other panels have discussed, about the power of movement, about the power of two-party politics, and about political action and mobilization, but also the shortcomings of these things. And then the fourth point, and this is probably the biggest, or I think the most radical point, is about the significance of economics, how they are fundamental to the idea of an open society or a democratic society, but that importantly, African Americans in the present day have embraced this idea, but they've embraced it under the umbrella of capitalism. So capitalism has become a site of protest, of resistance, right? A flawed site, but a site nonetheless, whereby people like Benjamin Crump, right, the lawyer for Trayvon Martin, right, for some of the families involved in many of these, involved in these kind of state-sanctioned violence programs, have seen capitalism or money as a way of rectifying something that the state is unwilling to deal with under the law. But we also see it as a site of protest in other spaces, popular culture spaces, including, for example, everybody's favorite performer, Beyonce, who at the same time, right, as she's doing these Black Power activist moves and performing an aesthetic of Black Power, has also announced that she is doing a tour, right, a very expensive tour, and launching a clothing line that draws on the idea of resistance, right, so that she can make money and use money as a method of uplift. So I am way out of time, so I'm going to stop here, but thank you so much, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you, Leah. Okay, very quickly, what my comments really are going to connect with all three talks. I'm reading here, and this has just been announced. This is CNN, Charlene. Under Bernie Sanders, income and jobs would soar, economists say. So this is just out. Somebody's saying, at least one economist saying that 26 million jobs would be created, unemployment rate would fall to 3.8%, and it would be the most ambitious economic program since the New Deal, but also Roosevelt, Truman, and President Johnson. And that leads me to my comments, because what I wanted to talk about was really the Great Society and the American racial imagination and what that means. And really, even as Leah was talking about Ed Brooke and his sort of a center-right alternative, what's interesting about the Great Society and really this idea of the war on poverty and this idea of extending the New Deal is that for African Americans who are on the left, certainly Martin Luther King Jr., but certainly the National Welfare Rights Organization, Beulah Sanders, Johnny Tillman, and even Stokely Carmichael and Black Power activists, what the Great Society does is actually push them to want more. I have written down here, the Great Society and the War on Poverty's announcement was greeted by the Urban League, the NAACP, Black Power activists, as with the line, "Great!" exclamation point. Where's the rest of it? Question mark. So when we think about the racial imagination in the Great Society, what's interesting is that within a year of the OEO being passed, the legislation, because Lyndon Johnson announces the legislation in January 1964, it's going to be about 9 months until it's passed, and he's not going to let anybody implement any war on poverty funds until after the '64 election, because he didn't want to be known as sort of trying to buy up votes. So we're going to start seeing the Great Society in 1965. And there's going to be a lot of pushback on the Great Society. Initially, Lyndon Johnson wanted 11 trillion. It's going to be 11 billion. It's going to be less than $1 billion a year. He makes different deals with Robert Byrd in the Senate and other, the Congress is obstreperous. But the positives of the Great Society is the fact that he's talking about poverty. But within 1 year, by 1966, Bayard Rustin and Martin Luther King Jr. and others would announce a freedom budget that would be $185 billion spent over 10 years to eliminate poverty and would include a guaranteed income. So what's interesting about the Great Society and the racial imagination, and this goes back to Jeremy's talk, there's a negative side of this too, of course, where in the racial imagination of what went wrong with the 1960s. Because remember, we deal too often, even in 2016, with polarities, the good 60s versus the bad 60s, right? And people do this with Dr. King and Malcolm X, Malcolm versus Martin. None of this stuff is true, but it's definitely something that has gripped our political imaginations. And when we think about what I want to focus on is the way in which political radicals utilize the Great Society and its shortcomings to actually push for a much more radical social, political, economic agenda. And what's so interesting, I think, about Bernie Sanders now and what people are talking about, and this, one economist says that this idea of 5.3% growth, and they say the median income under Bernie by 2026 will be $82,000, which is $23,000 a year more than the CBO is scoring for now. Another economist says this is hogwash. There's no way we get 5.3% growth. But what he's talking about now in 2016 is very similar to what African American activists were talking about in 1966, 1965, 1967. And so what the Great Society does, sometimes in an unintentional way, and this connects to Black Power activists vis-a-vis the Black Panthers and other activists, because remember, when we think about the Black Panthers, they print out their 10-point program, or really a 20-point program of what we want and what we believe at the North Oakland Community Anti-Poverty Center, which is getting funds from the Great Society. Amiri Baraka and the Black Arts Repertory Theater and School in 1965 in the summer in Harlem is getting some funds through the Har Youth Project, which is getting some money from the Great Society. So there are unintentional and unintended consequences vis-a-vis what African American political activists want from the Great Society. So even as Lyndon Johnson feels that the Great Society and the War on Poverty and the Office of Economic Opportunity, Sargent Shriver, this is going to be a legacy. Certainly, and we can talk about Vietnam like Jeremy alluded to, Vietnam is part of what forecloses aspects of the Great Society, but it's also the Senate and it's also the Congress. He's trying to get that through by saying it's really an education and training bill. He's trying to convince a Congress that's not necessarily sympathetic to anti-poverty, even though we remember the Congress of 1964 as a very liberal Congress, and certainly Julian Zelizer shows us that in the fierce urgency of now, there's only a small window until there's really the politics of backlash at the local level in 66. But that Congress of 64 is much less liberal than we might imagine and believe it to be. So when we think about the Great Society and the racial imagination, what's so interesting, I think, to me in the era of Black Lives Matter is how having a president talk about a great society and reimagine what citizenship could be for us all really pushed us beyond the boundaries of proscriptive democratic liberalism. So if Ed Brooke is one alternative, certainly Martin Luther King Jr.'s Poor People's Campaign is another alternative. And it's growing, the impetus of the Poor People's Campaign is obviously King's political activism and the trajectory of his career, but also what's happening on the ground. But what Lyndon Johnson and the OEO, the Office of Economic Opportunity, Sargent Shriver, VISTA, Volunteers in Service to America, what this provides us and what provides King and people like James Lawson, welfare rights activists, is an opening to say that citizenship now should have guarantees, even to the point where under Richard Nixon, the Family Assistance Plan, FAP, activists wanted a guaranteed income. When we get to 1969, 1970, 71, this is the last time we have an American president and a Congress saying, well, maybe we should consider a guaranteed income. And Nixon was ready to say yes to a guaranteed income at levels that were lower than welfare at the time, right? So that was the irony. But that's the last time we ever even talked about that as a society. So what's interesting about the Great Society is that it sets up a context, even as people are arguing and debating over its perceived failures, its perceived shortcomings. And one thing when we think about the successes, certainly Head Start is a huge success. We've got great studies on the Mississippi Child Development Group. My students are reading Carry It On by Susan Ashmore about the Great Society and the War on Poverty in Alabama between 1964 and 1972 specifically, and what that means. So I'll close here. I think one of the most important aspects of the Great Society is how it acknowledges, and this builds on Roosevelt, this builds on the New Deal. And Jeremy alluded to the Works Progress Administration, how we interviewed people who were former enslaved Africans, which historians use now. Ed Baptist, The Half Has Never Been Told, uses those thousands of interviews, and other historians have. I'm sure Salamisha and others have. The idea of a great society transformed America's racial and political imagination on multiple sides of the political divides. Even as Black Power activists criticized the Great Society, they also acknowledged that yes, there should be an end of poverty, that yes, there should be a guaranteed income. Yes, citizenship did require health care, which Bob was talking about. It required education. It required safety and security that went beyond the purview of segregated Jim Crow America in the mid-1960s. I think that certainly other political actors utilized the racial imagination of the Great Society to articulate something much different and more sinister, and at times very, very successfully. We talk about Ed Brooke, Ronald Reagan, 1976, and Pearlstein's book, The Bridge. It's in 76 when Reagan talks about welfare queens. It's 76. It's during that run at Gerald Ford. And the welfare queens are, in an unfortunate way, also connected to the Great Society. This racist caricature of black women as somehow the undeserving poor. So the Great Society expanded everybody's racial imagination. Black people thought that they could finally have an in and a president. Because remember, this is the president who March 15th, 1965 says, "We shall overcome." And not just that, he compares nonviolent demonstrators who are being beaten in Selma to revolutionary patriots who died and bled for democracy in Lexington and Concord. That's extraordinary that an American president does that. Of course you think that that person is on your side. He's saying, "I'm on your side," right? So from that perspective, African Americans thought finally they could use that window to lay a claim to citizenship in a more expansive way than they had ever before. And at the same token, white citizens saw a Pandora's box being opened up that allowed undeserving, lazy, marginalized citizens to claim what was their birthright. And we're still having that debate today, which I think is interesting and super important. Let's open it up. Let's open it up.
Thank you guys for this extraordinary panel. I'm like brimming with questions, but I'll just try to keep it to two. I am Brandon Terry. I am assistant professor of African American Studies at Harvard. So one I sort of wanted to pose to Jeremy and Bob in particular, and it's this question about, you spoke movingly about public housing and talked about one of its ways as a sort of failure of the Great Society. And you spoke in qualified terms of admiration about the fair housing movement, where, look, you tried to get the structure going, but there wasn't enough enforcement power behind it, and there wasn't enough of a constituency behind it. And I'm curious as to whether you think that black left social movements actually made a mistake in endorsing the fair housing movement instead of trying to really, really radically rethink public housing as the foundational right for American citizens in a much more expansive and egalitarian way. Because basically we've inherited many of the problems of the fair housing thing. The 2008 is in a lot of, the crash is linked in a lot of ways to how we think about housing and opportunity. Yeah. And so I wanted to put that on the table. And then the question more for Leah and Peniel about this capitalism and resistance question, which I found provocative. And I sort of think, is this not a problem with so foregrounding the race as a category of analysis that we lose a sense that, maybe it's just the case that Ed Brooke or Beyonce or people like this who see wealth as their main lever of power and authority in society and can't envision a society in which that's just not the case for anyone. That they're not, that they may think they're advocating on behalf of all black people, but they just can't possibly be insofar as, this class hierarchy would be intractable, and that we should see them more as epiphenomenal of the demise of any sense of society as a cooperative scheme for mutual benefit, and instead as a kind of war of all against all, where if you manage to get the wealth and the Rockefeller chain, you can do what you want to do, and if you use your wealth on behalf of the poor and disenfranchised, good for you. But you're not really altering the edifice of society that creates such a system.
I'll let you guys start.
Okay, housing's a really good example of the point I made earlier in that Johnson thought of these issues in a broad sense. So housing included strategies to include capital available for the housing markets. There's that element of it. There's the production of housing, housing assistance. So there really is a range of things in addition to the equal fair housing. My own personal view is I think fair housing is just a basic right, the democratic floor. Everybody should be able to live where they want. So a very liberal concept in that sense, and fundamental. If you don't have that to work with, you can't move forward. The bigger problem in housing is, I think this is an area where the conservative backlash has really been effective. Our housing policy today, a little bit on equal housing opportunity, but it's essentially a voucher program. A voucher program is a very market-oriented program. There's never enough money. There's issues about where the vouchers are going to be used. It really is not a very nimble policy to deal with affordable housing in the country. So I would say, I don't think it makes much difference what Black movement would have said about housing. I think the forces aligned against more equity in housing are enormous, and it's hard to fight back. There was, I thought, a reasonable attempt to expand home ownership in the 1990s, and that expansion of home ownership was one of the problems. We had the housing crisis later. Very, very difficult sector to work with, but I would say that's really, the public housing failed. I don't think after FDR, we never did really do it seriously. I mean, we built stuff, but it was not maintained. So to make public housing work effectively, we didn't do it in this country. Other countries have done it. I mean, it's not, it can be done. We chose not to, but I would see this more as a backlash, conservative backlash, than a failure of that particular policy.
I would agree with that. I think it's a great question you asked, Brandon,
Yeah.
and it's a big dilemma for activists, right? Do you go for the possibility of getting resources in the short run that ameliorate some of the short-term issues, or do you go after the structural issues? And I think what happened with fair housing, and it largely builds on the legacy of an abandoned set of impulses after World War II, but what begins to happen is that the short-term help is contributing to the long-term structural deficiencies, right? So the areas where fair housing is constructed, there are fewer jobs, and there are poorer schools. And they're in fact cut off. If you look at the design of highways in urban communities, Austin is a great example of this, right? East Austin's on the other side of 35, right? New Haven is divided by the highways, right? So you can have lots of short-term programs that are providing nice public housing in those areas that are being cut off, but in the long term, you're not providing economic opportunity. And I think two responses I have to that. I think activists need to weigh these issues very strategically. I don't want to give advice to activists because I don't think there's an easy answer to that. I think at the time there were very good reasons to embrace fair housing considering what the alternatives were. But we have to think about what the structural trade-offs are. And I think that's what every activist group needs to be talking about. When I talk to activists about the history of activism, I say you better be discussing those issues when you're talking about policy. It's not just what you're getting today. But the second thing I'd say is that it is the role of leadership to educate the public about the interrelationship between problems. And one of the things that happens in the Great Society, in part because of the complexity of the programs that are being thrown out so quickly, is they get debated as separate individual items. And there's a failure to talk about it as a whole, and where that enables conservative critics within the African American community and outside is they can pick off issues. Right? And anything like housing and opportunity is about, of course, the integration of health, education, shelter, jobs. I mean, there's so many things that go together, and you could do something for one and make things worse in another area. When it comes down to it, I don't see how you could ever have effective housing policy without a fundamental restructuring of urban education, which still hasn't happened, which I think Johnson wanted to do, but never really got to. In terms of the way urban education is funded, in terms of the way opportunity is defined, and certainly the backlash against busing makes it really, really impossible.
Quickly.
So, okay, so just to very quickly on this idea of capitalism as a mode of resistance, and kind of is it a reflection of, a tragic story of, the demise of cooperative initiatives and et cetera, et cetera. Absolutely, I think fundamentally at its core, this idea of capitalism as a mode of resistance is one that is pessimistic, right? So that believes that you can't necessarily change racism unless you have massive wealth. So in the shorthand, it's you may not respect me, you may not like me, but you will respect this money. Mm-hmm. And so there's a way in which, right, kind of arbiters of this or people who advocate this and people who really push this, and I would encourage the audience to really fundamentally look at the way in which many of these movements right now are operating under this idea of capitalism as a mode of, as uplift, how they fundamentally, right, suggest or believe in this idea of a moderate version of the American dream. So we're not talking about a radical, right, reimagining of what the American dream means or what democracy means, but rather instead people who are saying, I simply want to be a part of it. And because I think that I can't be a part of it because of the legal system, because of racist attitudes, what have you, I'm going to use my money to buy access and then open doors for other people. And so the last part of that, I think, to think about too, is that for many of these people, the problem is not capitalism, right? The problem is that there are too many black people on the bottom. So if we can have a fundamental reordering of the structure of capitalism, then hey, we'd be okay with that. And I think that's where you get into very tricky and troubling territory.
Can I ask a question about that, Peniel?
Sure.
So I, as a fellow historian, I'm curious on your assessment of that, though, because it does seem to me that on the one hand, that's a very persuasive and pragmatic argument. On the other hand, African-American incomes have gone up considerably in 20 to 30 years, and yet it would seem to me, on many dimensions, we've seen a reversal.
Yeah.
So it does seem, at least in one way a historian could look at this, please feel free to disagree, is that in fact the historical record sort of negates that argument. That as the incomes have grown at a certain level, right, as you have Prince George's County, as you have a lot of pockets of African-American wealth, people who have embraced capitalism, it's not evident to me, but correct me please, it's not evident to me that it's actually improved public policy around these issues.
Well, I don't think it fundamentally has, but the belief is still there, right? That money is an arbiter. Money is something that changes the system.
Yeah.
And so when I use that line about like you may not respect me, you may not like me, you may be racist, but you will respect this money. I'm actually quoting lyrics, from not just one song that came out 2 days ago, but do a Genius scan of any rap lyric written in the past 5 years. So even as it is a flawed approach, right? Even as history has shown us that racism will persist no matter how much money you have, just look at Oprah Winfrey, it's still seen as, this way of bypassing the system and maybe alleviating some of the pain of still being excluded from the system.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Questions?
Well, I have a question about
Can you
the Great
identify
Society.
yourself, please?
Oh, Mary Freitag, and I'm a local citizen. I know about the Great Society, but I'm sort of surprised. I'm not surprised as historians that you're examining it, but talking about that in the context of Black Lives Matter and how people now on the ground see it and what they're going to do and everything, it seems pretty obscure. I don't hear anyone talking about the Great Society in any part of my life, really. People are sort of aware, that was civil rights and that was the education, the Brown versus, and that's what that's about. But I'm just wondering how that works for.
Yeah, no, I would tackle this. No, I think it's hugely important in the context of Black Lives Matter, and I'll tell you why. What's going on, and this also connects with Bernie Sanders, and when I mention Bernie, I'm saying Bernie Sanders as somebody who is suggesting a certain kind of political and policy framework and approach for the country. So what's very important at this point, what Black Lives Matter is talking about is a fundamental restructuring of American democracy. And what the Great Society portended for some was that same kind of fundamental restructuring. Now, we know what happened, and it both wasn't as successful as it hoped, and it wasn't the failure that its critics demonize it as. And the reason why a great society is more important now than ever, and we could also talk about the New Deal, is because we live at a critical juncture where, when we even look at the last 50 years of American politics, the Sanders campaign is probably the first campaign since Lyndon Johnson in '64 to talk about poverty in a major way. Now, what Sanders is talking about is going even beyond what Lyndon Johnson was talking about in '64. He's talking about $14.5 trillion of spending over a 10-year period, which is extraordinary. And so and some economists are saying, where's it going to come from? He's saying it's going to come from basically Keynesian economics. He's going back to the 1930s and 40s and saying, look, what got us out of the Great Depression is the call to arms, and that's a great book by one of my former colleagues, Maury Klein, 1,000 pages, on what happened between 41 and 45 and how we came from a country that had no Navy and Air Force to speak of to, in 4 years, the greatest military superpower that the world had ever seen. And what that meant in terms of creating both prosperity, there was labor shortages, manpower shortages, provided more African American women and white women and Latino women jobs in industries that they never had before this. So what World War II does through this spending, we just spend. We spent more in the run-up, the call to arms, than we did through the entire New Deal, right? And that's what gets us, after a short 2-3 year period of food and clothes shortages, the 1948 to 1973 economic prosperity that Thomas Piketty talks about in Capital in the 21st Century, that he's claiming is a bubble that will never happen again. That's what he's saying.
The one part of this I would add to Neil's excellent comments, and that's a really good question, is I would say it's certainly alive and well in the criticisms of the right of the federal government and of government in general, right? So what are the three things at the top of Ted Cruz's list that he's attacking, Senator Ted Cruz, right? He's attacking affirmative action, Great Society policy. He's attacking aid to families with dependent children, Great Society policy. And he's attacking the existence of the Department of Ed and Health and Human Services as we know them, all Great Society agencies. So it's certainly there. It might not be labeled Great Society, but it's certainly at the center of these debates.
Let me give another answer to it with a different approach. One of the really interesting things about the 1960s is all of this legislation that Johnson passed, I don't think would have happened if there had not been the Civil Rights Movement. Yeah. I think there's social change at work that kind of helps set the stage. And with the Black Lives Matter, there's real serious public policy problems. People look at this, not everybody, but many people are outraged. So part of the movement is bringing up to national vision so everybody can see it, of things that are fundamentally wrong. Now, there's other elements that are missing in our national governance right now where we should, I don't think we should expect much in terms of change of national legislation, but it happened in 1960 to everybody's surprise. So I think that part of it, identifying real issues people can look at and say that's not fair, rally the troops, create public pressure for legislative change.
I know that I have at least 2 questions, because
Okay,
otherwise Professor Greenberg will not let me forget it. So I'm going to start with this gentleman here and then tumble down the stairs. Okay?
Hi, Minka Makalani in African Diaspora Studies here at UT. I guess I have a question that maybe takes a discussion momentarily, albeit in a different direction, and that is kind of the limitation of policy as a real substantive solution. Oh. And I'm thinking in 2 contexts. One, they're related. So Richard Eiton in Search for the Black Fantastic has this line about the citizen needing this kind of paradigmatic black as its opposite, its other, that substantiates itself. And the way he puts it, the citizen needs the nigger. To have this liberal democratic project, either in the neoliberal vein or a pre-neoliberal iteration, that interplay persists. And then when you get to Ferguson, at least, if not also in Baltimore, I think you see kind of a rejection, if you will, of policy, of the state as something that will offer a viable solution. Thus, these kind of pitched battles and confrontation with police. And this is all over North County and St. Louis, as well as in Baltimore, where you have, not in Ferguson, but other places in North County, black-led municipal governments, police departments. And this is the same thing with Baltimore. So I'm wondering if, in thinking about what the Great Society might say for Black Lives Matter, does Black Lives Matter kind of insist on a more radical response to policy as even a possibility, given that even in the wake of the Great Society policies, however attenuated they've become, they haven't actually addressed the structural problems I think that you're suggesting, Leah. they haven't addressed those structural problems that lie at the root of making capitalism seem like a viable option. They haven't addressed like the carceral state. And I'm just wondering, can policy actually do that, or are we kind of spinning our wheels?
Very, very quickly, and I'm going to give it to Leigh. I think that's a great question and comment, Minka. I think that, one, when it comes to Black Lives Matter and protests in Ferguson, Chicago, Baltimore, the things that we've seen, it really depends. Some, and I've been in touch with local Black Lives Matter groups, some are concerned about policy, and they want radical policy interventions vis-a-vis both criminal justice, but also employment, jobs, social services, what's going on in their local municipalities who are giving them warrants. Stefan Bradley talked about that earlier when we think about the consent decree in Ferguson and St. Louis. So some, policy, I'd say yes, policy matters. Your notion of even more radical, revolutionary, structural transformation also matters. And are people discussing that and talking about that? Yes. And you can make the argument that what we need now is that. So it's going to be still a liberal democratic capitalism, but it's a capitalism that skews much closer to what we saw in the aftermath of the New Deal than what we've seen since. And then finally, for the young people, there are, and I've written about this, the young people in Ferguson who were hectoring Al Sharpton and hectoring civil rights activists, they are a group and a generation, especially class-wise. And you saw young people in Ferguson who were on CNN and MSNBC, and they had poor teeth. They had teeth that were missing, and they were teenagers, and they were speaking to people. That is a product of endemic poverty in 2014 and 15. Nobody who's middle class has bad teeth. Nobody. So it was heartbreaking to see, but we also understood what was going on. This connects to what Jeremy was talking about with public education. They haven't received quality public education. They haven't received the same kind of child care and other services that their counterparts who are in a different social economic class have received. And they are angry about a narrative that has been given to them that because Barack Obama is president, there is no more racism. And some of them were saying this on CNN when they weren't being ridiculed by Don Lemon. Aaron Burnett wasn't calling them thugs and basically the N-word. They were saying it. It was a cri de coeur. They were crying out about all this inequality that they're feeling and experiencing, but they can't articulate it the way we can over here. So I think all those three things are very important. But yes, policy matters. The only way to get young Black and Latino boys and girls who are in our juvenile justice system right now in solitary confinement in federal and state prisons is through policy. It's the only way. So any changes we want, policy matters, but certainly it has to go beyond policy in a neoliberal context.
Let me offer a complementary observation. I think this is one of the fundamental problems and potential critiques of the Great Society. I said before, Johnson, I'm not going to get teary-eyed about what Johnson as a person wanted, but I think as a political system, our expectation was if we elected African Americans, if we elected minorities to local state governance, public policy would improve. If we appointed into our bureaucracies minorities, that our public bureaucracies, the performance would improve, particularly police departments. If police departments are manned primarily by African Americans, that they would be able to understand local communities better. My sense is we have a few really glaring cases where that has not happened. I think if you look more broadly across the country, that the local governance is working better than these few cases would represent. But it does raise the question, well, in those cases where we do have failure, why? Flint, it's a good example. Jesus. A deteriorated economy, a local government that cannot support itself. So that's a structural item, how local governments are structured, what kind of economy do local governments have. So it's kind of a long answer, but it's a great question, and a question that I think we should all give some thought to.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I just want to say one thing quick. quickly, I do want to point out, and I know there's been some talk about this, especially within, I think, left-wing academic circles, about the Voting Rights Act is supposed to bring the promise of black radical change, right? And so we see this massive jump in the number of black voters, we see this massive jump in the number of black elected officials, and yet we still see the same problems because we're existing under kind of this framework of a neoliberal, right, domestic order. That being said, I do think policy matters, but I think one of the things that we have to look at in terms of structure is what is the impact of one political party not being integrated at all? And this is something that, in particular amongst activist circles, I think that we have been unwilling to do, in part because that particular party has been so hostile to African American interests for so very long. But what are the consequences of that, right? What happens in the kind of the deliberation aspect of it? So that's one part of it. The other part that I think is worth thinking about is thinking about the limits. You're right, thinking about the limits of public policy. And I think this is what is the really interesting kind of dynamic of Black Lives Matters, which is that there is a component that kind of shuns this aspect of public policy and says, in fact, we have to focus on grassroots activism and working, right, not just with legislating, but actually changing the hearts and minds of men. It's not just a phrase that Barry Goldwater uses in 1964, it's also a phrase that Martin Luther King uses over and over and over again. And it's one in which kind of Black Power activists use, I think, continually, right, from the mid-1960s onward. So there is a way, I think, that that's useful in thinking about expanding, to use kind of Peniel's idea, this idea of the racial imagination of what we see that goes beyond policy as a solution, right, to what we're talking about.
I have to say something. I mean, it's a great question, and these were all terrific answers. I don't know what the alternative to policy is. I mean, at a certain level, right, even the most grassroots activities, you can be a little more distant from the day-to-day policy process, but policy is there. Policy is with you wherever you are. You go into a school, right? There's policy all around you, right? You go into a prison, there's policy all around you, right? So escaping that, I understand the urge, and I understand how policy shouldn't imprison our imagination, which is, I think, the point all of you have made really, really well. But I don't see how you can get away from it. It's like saying you want to go to school and get away from politics. Well, you don't get away from it, right? It's there with you everywhere. And so at a certain level, when I hear that argument made very well, as you did, I sometimes also I react against it because I think, in a sense, it cedes the territory to others. I think that the best way to explain what's happened since the Great Society is that others have played policy better than those who saw great hope in the Great Society. It didn't have to be that way. And so that's sort of where I come at it. In some ways, it's a terminological issue, I think, more than anything else.
All right, we're going to do one more question, and then we're going to close and take our break.
Sherry Greenberg, LBJ School. Very fascinating discussion, and I certainly do believe that there are policy issues, but also structural issues. And I've been researching, wondering about a framework, and that is, and it's across the board, and it's equitable access. For democracy to work, you have to have equitable access. For the free market economy to work, you have to have equitable access. And when I look across these range of issues, whether it's voting rights or vouchers, the choice program, and landlords won't accept the vouchers, whether it's equitable access to living in high opportunity neighborhoods, complete communities with the clinics and everything else, I wonder if a way to frame this is not the framework of equitable access.
Very quickly, I think equitable access, Sherry, I mean, that's a great idea. I think that the problem, especially when we think about neoliberalism, this idea of neoliberalism, which is away from classical liberalism, post-war, sometimes post-60s, this idea of monetization, privatization, militarization, right? Incarceration. These are the things that are guiding us now. And I do agree with Leah when she said, she defined Obama as a neoliberal, and I say that as a critical supporter of Obama. We've gotten away from the idea that we can actually produce wealth and whole communities without monetization, privatization, militarization, right? And incarceration. We've gotten away from that. Those are our guiding principles as Americans. And one of the things I've gotten from Brandon's work and also Lawrence's work, Brandon's talked about the purchasing of citizenship. And when Lawrence looks at communities in Chicago and talks about renegade dreams and can a black former gang member who's now physically handicapped from the activities that he or she was a part of, do they have access to citizenship? The answer is no. The short answer is no. And what's really tragic is that even before they were physically handicapped, the answer was still no. And our policies right now, the interesting thing about the Great Society, and this gets back to this question, why we have to talk about it in the context of Black Lives Matter, the 60s was the last time we talked about this, and we addressed it since this last 24 months. The death of Trayvon Martin, Sandra Bland, Tamir Rice, it's not gone in vain because we've seen the protests at Yale, at UT, we've seen the protests that have shut down highways. The reason why Khalil Muhammad is coming to the Kennedy School is because of this movement. The reason why I'm here is because of this movement. Ta-Nehisi Coates doesn't win a National Book Award in regular years. No. And it's not that the work doesn't count. It's not that he's not a great writer. It's that people don't care, right? The reason why they're doing an Oscar so white and people are boycotting. Will Smith wasn't boycotting when they invited him to the ceremony, right? This is a new day, right? It's a new day. And so we're trying to figure out this is leading to conversations once again about massive public policy intervention, massive social welfare to transform. And the reason we're talking about Great Society and Black Lives Matter, the last time we tried it was Great Society, and all we've done through 50 years is demonize that. And that's why so many of our young people don't think about public policy. The very people who need it, don't think about it and feel that they're on the margins because of all this inequity that has persisted, right? So if we can at least address this and address racism within the context of neoliberalism, finally we begin this conversation where, like I agree with Jeremy, it has to be innovative. The plans we use in the 21st century are not going to be the Great Society LBJ plans, but it gives us a context to talk about what innovative policies we need to help young black men and women on the west side and south side of Chicago. I mean, we've got people dying every day in Chicago, in St. Louis, in all around this country, and people don't care. Their lives don't matter. And can we have policies to address that? I agree. I say yes. But we also need grassroots activism and a social movement that gives us enough leverage, because we're not going to have the money. We're outspent by hedge funds. We're outspent by corporations. We will not have the money. But a social movement can leverage policy, and that's what we've seen happen. Anybody else? All right, this is going to be, that's all right. I dropped the mic.